Broadcasting live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. It's the man always out front on the issues. You're listening to Out Front with Mike Shelby.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Out Front. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. We're going to start today's show off with a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, thank you for watching the show. If you want to continue watching these live streams, listen, next Monday, we're going to move this show off of the Forward Observer channel and onto the Out Front channel. And there's a link down in the description. Please do me a favor, hit the subscribe button to the new channel, Out Front with Mike Shelby, so that you can continue watching these. And the reason why we're doing this is pretty simple. Someone said, someone shared one of the videos the other day, and they said, well, you gotta be careful watching that guy. When he allows YouTube to determine what he says or doesn't say on his show, you really have to watch out. And that's actually a very, very good point. So I'm going to be a lot more me once we move the show off Forward Observer, and maybe Forward Observer gets spared. Eventually I'll get kicked off of YouTube, so we'll be on all the other streaming platforms as well. All right, let's go ahead and jump into today's show, because we have this item here from Nexta, and Nexta is a Eurozone news outlet. And actually, Ben, if you would please put this, yeah, there we go. Great. I bring this up because this is the reality, or this will be the reality, of a worsening low-intensity conflict here in the United States. Now, Nexta is reporting, and I've seen this on I was reading a Polish news outlet today that was also reporting on this. A pro-Russian blogger named Valery Kuleshov was killed in Kherson, Ukraine, and as you can see, it looked like he was gunned down while he was in his vehicle. Nexta reports, quote, "It is reported that Kuleshov actively cooperated with the invaders," they're talking about the Russians, "and even applied for the position of chief of the occupation of the city," end quote. Now, Kuleshov is reportedly a former member of a pro-Russian pro-Russian militia in Ukraine. It's unclear why he was killed or by whom, but there's one very obvious potential answer here. That is simply the Ukrainians killed him because they saw him as a Russian collaborator. Actually, Ben, if you want to roll that video for me while I go through this. So this is the video that's being reported on a couple of places. Yeah, and actually MJ says it's not looking good for Gonzalo Lira either. Look, Gonzalo Lira is at minimum a Chilean citizen, and he was somewhere in Ukraine. And he said, look, if you don't hear from me for at least like 12 or 24 hours, it's probably because I've been abducted. And Gonzalo Lira is missing as well. So this may be a fairly concerted effort on behalf of the Ukrainians to go after the people who they believe are Russian collaborators. But I bring this up because this could be the reality of our low-intensity conflict here in the United States. We are in a lull. There's just not a lot of reporting because there's not a lot going on. But as we get into closer to November, and certainly in November 2024, that whole 24 election cycle is going to be very, very likely to be a much different story. Now, just one second. This is a potential future of the United States here. And this is the reason why I bring this up, because this could become commonplace, just as common as it is in Mexico. Now, yesterday on Tuesday, I did the first Latin American intel brief called LATAM View, and I talked about the political situation in Mexico. And here's the reality. There have been daily, there are assassinations, murders, kidnapping, like assassinations of known public figures, murders of just common people, abductions and kidnappings. People just disappear. Some of these people they never find. As a matter of fact, if you go back to the 2018 election cycle in Mexico, there were 112 politicians in Mexico who were assassinated during that election cycle. In the 2021 election cycle, there were 102 politicians who were gunned down, assassinated by gunmen. This is likely to be carried out not just by cartels, right? Because cartels, they're trying to gain political power and influence. Taking out a rival politician is a relatively straightforward process if this cartel is trying to get their guy elected. This also may be the result of direction of political parties, and actually one political party in particular, because one thing I brought up yesterday is that in almost all these cases, the political party who predominantly benefited was a party called Morena, and that is the Mexican president's political party, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, got me called AMLO. So this is political violence of the highest order, as we have seen, and I bring this up because as we have seen over the past roughly 2.5 years, the over there problems are no longer over there. Over there problems can become over here problems pretty quick. And we are going to live through a lot more over there problems because food scarcity and supply chain disruption and all those other types of things, that's something that happens in other countries historically. But, at least in most of our lifetimes, we have been feeling that it's very likely to worsen over the next year or two here in the United States. This should concern you. And I'm not here, my hair's not on fire, I'm not here to tell you the world is ending, but this should concern you because this could become the future of the United States. Now, that is a dark scenario, but it is not actually the worst case scenario. There are far worse scenarios. And I don't intend any of this to be a prediction, and I'm not trying to scare people, and I'm not trying to push doom and gloom on anyone. Hopefully, most of you realize this is a possibility. The likelihood is not zero. And I'm very concerned about what is going to be happening during the 2024 elections. And look, if it's not 24, it could just as easily be 28. So I don't think, and actually Jeff Gundlach, who runs Double Line Capital, they have maybe $150 billion in assets under management. Yeah, he said, you think 2020 was bad. 2024 is going to be worse. And he said 2028 is when everything pops off. Now, I don't know if he's right, but he manages $150 billion. He makes a lot of money making good bets. Otherwise, he would not be managing that amount of money. So I just keep that kind of stuff in the back of my mind. Of course, Gundlach's not the only guy who said that. But this is something I've really focused on. Low intensity conflict, worsening conflict here in the United States. I focused on it, kind of made it my life in 2016. And frankly, it's one of the main reasons why I started Forward Observer back in 2015, 2016 anyway. Now, as long as we're talking about conflict, we also need to talk about peace. I was looking at different degree plans at these colleges basically across the country, and they have peace studies. Oh, they've got a peace studies. You can get a master's degree in peace studies. And really the study of peace is actually the study of war. This is like peace is just the natural state of things unless there's some sort of violence. And so really, if you're studying peace, you're studying the outbreak of war, i.e. how to prevent it or how to bring about the end of war and get back into peace. Now, last year I read a book called Peace Building as Politics, Cultivating Peace in Fragile Societies. And Ben, if you want to show that book, I got the image there. Now, this may kind of sound like, mamby-pamby. It's definitely, master's degree pablum that you have to read. But this is actually an interesting book. It's a good book. This surveys the efforts to build peace in war-torn countries, specifically in fragile societies, which, by the way, the United States, I think, will become a fragile society this decade, if not and it could become a failed state. That's not my base case, but we could be on the verge of that later this decade. But this book goes into Haiti, Somalia, Cambodia, El Salvador, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And there's actually a lot of lessons learned in here. More than anything, I'm interested in two things. The first is, what have other societies done to either prevent war or done to achieve peace after a conflict, to achieve lasting peace I forget the study, but at the end of one civil war, there's actually a very good risk of another civil war kicking off. Ireland is a really great example. You have the Irish Troubles, a low intensity conflict that gets resolved, and then you have a civil war break out between the two factions in Ireland. So, I look at that, and that is in a lot of places been the historical norm. So that obviously also concerns me for later this decade. I mean, there's a lot of things that could happen, not necessarily saying the worst case scenario will happen. But the first thing is, how have societies achieved lasting peace after the war? And the second is, what are the lessons learned to win peace locally? Because with low intensity conflict, we covered this a couple weeks ago. There's a tiny fraction of people who are actually involved in fighting. It's like, in most cases, it's like less than 1%. It's like 0.5% or less in many cases. And so that's going to leave a lot of places like central Nebraska. I just don't expect any kind of terrorism or political violence in central Nebraska, for instance, right? I mean, not like, and you actually look at a map of Ireland during the Troubles, and a lot of the violence was actually isolated to large population centers, specifically where they were Protestants and Catholics. So there are a lot of places that are going to be, I don't know, maybe deep blue or deep red that I just don't, it's probably not going to be ground zero for low intensity conflict. At any rate, I have some notes here that I want to go through. And by the way, we will probably have some time for questions today if you want to post your questions into the chat. Someone's asking if it still will be available on Forward Observer. Yeah, it'll be a new link. There's a brand new YouTube. It's actually not brand new, but youtube.com/outfront with Mike Shelby. That's where these videos will be, probably starting next week on Monday. All right. So after the Soviet collapse, man, I wish I actually had this chart here, but you look at the number of low intensity conflicts during the Cold War specifically, and they increased after World War II. They started to increase, and they increased and increased. And then all of a sudden, in 1991, the number of insurgencies globally dropped. I mean, like the floor just absolutely dropped out underneath it, and the number went down dramatically. Okay, well, let's think. What happened in 1991? Well, that was the end of the Soviet Union, right? So the collapse of the Soviet Union. What happened was the United States and the Soviet Union, instead of going to war conventionally against each other, which would have been mutually assured destruction, which, by the way, we may be getting closer to here between NATO and Russia right now. Low intensity conflict, waging insurgencies or enabling foreign countries to wage insurgencies against established governments on one side, and then the other side was coming in and helping the government to secure power, to defeat the insurgency through counterinsurgency. And this was a kind of a global game of chess. Afghanistan's a really good example. This exact same thing is happening right now in Ukraine with Western support to the defense of Ukraine. And conceivably, eventually, the Ukrainians will get into more guerrilla warfare type resistance, and Ukraine just very well could become another Syria or another Afghanistan with the way that these state powers are choosing to fight each other right now. Ukraine really is just a conflict between NATO and Russia. So at any rate, the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of a sudden, one side of the equation that was funding all these insurgencies, especially the communist insurgencies, all that funding dried up, and then insurgencies started to disappear. Now, the question that I have is, another thing that happened during the Soviet collapse is you had these former Soviet countries that were formerly under the rule of a communist party in that state, like Romania and Hungary, a number of other countries, right? And all of a sudden, there was no longer the Soviet support to keep those governments in power. And so what happened is, as Soviet-backed insurgencies decreased, the amount of civil wars started to increase. And because now you have populations who could rebel against the government and kick off a civil war, because now there are no longer the Soviets around to come to the aid and help repress the resistance. So my question is, if our key assumption, which is my key assumption, that the American empire is going to collapse at some point over the next 20 years, where can we expect new conflicts? Where are the countries globally that are held together right now, where American money and power and influence, the promise of American military might is keeping those countries together? Because if we just look at how history could repeat itself, the Soviet empire, the Soviets collapse, and then you get a bunch of civil wars. And now in the next 20 to 40 years, the American empire is going to collapse. Where are those countries where civil wars could become the norm once the United States goes? I think that's a very good question, and it's something I will be taking a much deeper look at. Another note I have in here is about the length of these civil wars. And specifically, we're talking about low intensity conflict here. The Bosnian Civil War lasted for 4 years. The war in El Salvador lasted for 12 years. Cambodia, 25 years. Somalia and Haiti have experienced multiple decades of unrest and violence and conflict. This is a good point, because low intensity conflict is not going to be over in just a couple of years. We've already demonstrated that. This low intensity conflict here has started in earnest in 2016. I think you can make an argument that maybe the class aspect of this low intensity conflict started back in 2008 with the great financial crisis. And so, the global financial crisis and the Great Recession. So we are already at a minimum, roughly 6 years into this. And I think it's going to worsen this decade and get much worse. So these countries where, like El Salvador, you had low intensity conflict for 12 years, Cambodia, 25 years. Look, a decade long or potentially multi-decade long low intensity conflict in the United States is not unheard of. And you look at the Irish Troubles that lasted for, 20 years or however long, that was over the span of a couple decades, and actually much longer if you want to go back to the post World War I, the Irish independence movement, back in the 1918, 20, 21 thereabout. That's the next point. All right. In all 5 instances, in all these countries I just mentioned, Bosnia, El Salvador, Cambodia, Somalia, and Haiti, they all required international support for stability. And so if we look at international involvement in a low intensity conflict here in the United States, and again, this is probably a scenario where there's a legitimacy crisis from the government. Maybe we have state electors, and these are things that Democrats have talked about. What happens when a Republican state legislature does not vote for or does not confirm the state electors that were a result of the election? And I think that's a good question for both red and blue states. What could happen here? So if we do get into a massive legitimacy crisis, and there's just a lot of ways that could go, we look at the potential for international support to the United States, either on the side of resistance or the side of the government. And we're looking at things like lethal aid, right? That's one thing we're sending to Ukraine right now. The Biden administration just announced another $800 million package going to Ukraine. We've heard from the Germans that their support, that's been slow walked, but their military support to the Ukrainians in terms of military aid has depleted some of their stores. I didn't read the article, but I just saw an article entitled U.S. military support to Ukraine is depleting the arsenal of democracy here. So, what would lethal aid look like? And I don't have all the answers. This is more a question for you. Think about your local situation. Do your area study. Identify the extreme right and extreme left groups that exist in your area. And let's start thinking about what could this actually look like? Because so much of preparedness is thinking about the things that could happen. And actually, Napoleon Bonaparte was actually very clear about this. He said, look, this is not a direct quote, but he said, look, if you think I'm successful, it's because I have thought for a really long time and foreseen what may occur. And when you think about things and you war game things out and foresee what may occur, Well, now we have a list of scenarios. We call them potential courses of action. And once you develop your potential courses of action, now we can start looking for evidence or indicators that support that potential course of action. Like, is, A, B, or C going to happen? Well, we may not be in a position to say A will definitely happen. However, we think A is more likely than B, and B is more likely than C. And once we know that, we can start preparing for those very specific scenarios. Um, Obviously, we have to keep an eye on it because things change. But so much of what I do is geared towards that, enabling people to look at their scenario, look at their situation on the local level, do their area study, and figure out what's more likely to affect them than less likely. All right, after lethal aid, we have non-lethal aid, not NGOs, non-government organizations, responsible, very likely responsible for a lot of the heavy lifting back in Euromaidan in Ukraine back in 2014. What would NGO support to the United States look like? Like foreign or international NGOs or foreign money flooding into domestic non-governmental organizations. We actually saw quite a bit of that in 2020. There are all these think tanks, and I forget the exact name of it, but there was a group of political scientists, and they formed a like an election committee or something like that, and they basically wargamed what would a failed election look like and what could happen. Listen, if millions of dollars are being poured into NGOs for them to study the effects and consequences of a failed election, you should probably give it a little bit of thought as well. That's why I'm on the show every day, and I think more and more I'll probably be focused a little bit more on domestic issues. Next is humanitarian aid. What might humanitarian aid look like? There are three other notes that I have here for foreign support or foreign intervention in an American low-intensity conflict. The first is disarmament efforts. This is something that we've seen in, actually, the FARC in Colombia is a really good example. Back in 2016, the FARC struck a peace deal with the Colombian government, and they said, yeah, we're going to demilitarize. And as a part of the agreement, the Colombian government said, okay, FARC, we're going to give you, the FARC is this Marxist, Leninist, communist guerrilla group. And they said, well, we're going to give you representation. We're going to give you seats in the Colombian legislature. And that was kind of the reward for them laying down their arms and promising to stop their fight against the Colombian government. So that's disarmament, maybe a decent example. Election monitoring is a big thing. Actually, I want to recall, like, the UN was like threatening to send or saying that they might send election monitors. They may have already been here in 2020. I don't know. International election monitoring groups may become the norm in the United States. We may see increased activity from those groups. And that's obviously a massive can of worms. That's also very concerning. And then also international civilian police. So the peacekeepers, it's difficult to imagine foreign peacekeepers on American soil. I don't think it'll go over real well, but historically, that's what we've seen in other low intensity conflicts. I'm just looking at logical conclusions, maybe what we can expect here in the United States, as this is the reality of what a low intensity conflict could look like. Now, I doubt this conflict is going to be over anytime soon. It's already been waging for at least the last 6 years. It's probably going to get worse over the next 2 to 3 years, I imagine. So the next thing my mind shifts to is, and we'll end the show here with some questions, but here's some rhetorical questions for you. What steps can you take locally? Like, let's say that we do have a worsening low intensity conflict. Let's say it even erupts into a legitimate civil war and I've drawn the distinction between low intensity conflict and civil war. If there is domestic military involvement, if the U.S. military responds to this, and there's sustained violence on both sides and also a body count, then I think that will get into the territory of civil war. If that doesn't happen, then what we're looking at by definition is low intensity conflict. That's the low intensity part of this, below the threshold of conventional war, but above routine peaceful competition. Okay, that's the kind of the gray area. where the country's not really at war, but it's definitely not at peace. Um, that's why I'm so big on the gray zone, understanding the gray zone, understanding what happens there. The better we can understand the gray zone, the better we can influence what happens in it and achieve our objectives. So, what steps can you take to build long term sustainability for your community if we do have a worsening low intensity conflict? And there's just some simple things here, stuff like food and water. That's all super basic prepper stuff. Next is utilities. One of the things that we have seen in like Iraq is a really good example. Al Qaeda in Iraq and these other some other insurgent and extremist groups in Iraq try to target, and in some cases were successful in targeting critical infrastructure, targeting utilities, because they said, look, we cut everyone's power. We demonstrate the government is ineffective. Look, the Americans, they can't even keep your power on. You think they're going to keep you safe? Do you think they're actually going to win this thing? And, that's kind of an example of striking at the legitimacy or striking at the capacity, especially of the government, reducing the capacity of the government. If you're an insurgent, that's in some instances, that's what you'll try to do. So utilities, how can we protect utilities? How can we protect critical infrastructure? How can we make sure that our world keeps spinning? We still have running water. We still have power. We still have sewers are still working, water purification, so on and so forth. Next is security. How are we going to provide security for the community? We know in low intensity conflicts, it's not just the political, cultural, social groups who are the belligerents. There's also criminal activity. And criminal activity could be things like cartels. It could be things like drug gangs, street gangs, who may be somewhat apolitical, maybe opportunist. And so it's not just just because you say, well, there's no left-wing groups in my area. There's no right-wing groups in my area. It doesn't mean that you are safe. You very well may have opportunistic crime. So the question is, how are you going to secure your community if the worst case scenario does happen? And then next is legitimacy and governance. How can you promote legitimacy for yourself? I think there's, I'm about to go on a tirade here, but maybe there is this like fantasy prepper, LARPer. These people live in LARP land and they just think, okay, the power's just going to shut off one day and I'm going to go kit up and I'm going to go, I don't know, maybe unite my neighborhood. Guys, if these people don't know who you are, they're not going to trust you. And if the first time these people encounter you, you're in your, Amazon kit or wherever you bought the stuff from and a helmet and an AR-15, these people are very unlikely to cooperate with you. They have no idea who you are. You don't have their trust. You don't have their legitimacy. Something we talked about, was it last week or maybe a couple of days ago? And so you absolutely must begin establishing trust and legitimacy in your community. And one of the ways you can do that is by building an area preparedness network, which I harp on continuously, because that preparedness network will allow us to link in local churches, link in local charity or humanitarian aid organizations. And once we start building those relationships and you can start earning trust, basically putting in goodwill into the community and building rapport with these people. Now, if the lights turn off for whatever reason, if the lights go off, now these people may be a lot more willing to listen to you because they say, oh, Mike's been doing this. He's been running this thing for 2 years. He's got a plan. Like, let me go see how I can help that. Or I trust Mike, or I trust you. Let me go see how I can support you because I think you've probably got it figured out. Or maybe you have the best plan out of anybody in the area. That's the kind of stuff we need to be doing. With that, we'll go ahead and Ben, if you can help me look for these questions, we'll get into some Q&A for a couple minutes here before we bounce. Will you still be streaming on the high side? On this show, I probably will not because I will get a lot more political on this show and probably get a lot more into my political philosophy and just be me. And it's just easier to do that away from Forward Observer, even though I'm still at Forward Observer. This will just be my show and I don't have to worry about, really blurring the lines too much. Let's see. What do you think about joining a local CERT team to find like-minded folks in your area? Absolutely. Community Emergency Response Team, CERT, CERT. You absolutely should be joining those, volunteering. Go through, there's a bunch of online classes. Incident Command System, the ICS, that's through like FEMA. Yeah, take those classes. If you join your local CERT, a lot of times the organizations will actually like send you to will send you to certain schools to learn skills like like hazardous materials, like how to handle them, how to clean up. Yeah, basically make you a subject matter expert in some of these things so you can assist local authorities during an emergency. Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. What do you think about joining your local ham operator group? Yeah, I think you should go. My um, brother-in-law and father-in-law went to their county ham group, and like my father-in-law was the youngest person there, so I thought that was funny. But yeah, you should absolutely make those connections and links. All right, lots of questions. What about the 2020 BLM riots that occurred all over the place in the big cities in every state that are deep blue, and even the rest of the state is red? Yeah, listen, that's something you're going to have to figure out. Do your area study and figure out what groups are in your backyard. And that's probably going to go a long way in developing expectations for the future. If you don't know what groups are in your backyard, you cannot have accurate expectations of the future. That's why everyone must do an area study. You have to know these things. It's not something I can do for you. Do you have any tips on discernment when looking at news stories in this era of propaganda? Yes. So the first thing, okay, coming from a QMIT background, one of the first things I'm going to look at is what is the source of this information, right? This is something that Max rails on all the time. He's like, all these New York Times and Washington Post and all these other organizations, they're quoting unnamed American sources. And we see a lot of this anonymous report, according to anonymous sources. And I'm naturally suspicious about that. And frankly, I just don't trust journalistic integrity anymore from most people. There are maybe a handful of people who I will be more willing to consider their anonymous sources. But the first thing is I'm going to look at the source. And people say, oh, the New York Times, or oh, it's from CNN, or oh, it's from whatever. And as a general rule of thumb, yeah, that's fine to say, well, I'm not going to trust everything that CNN reports on its face. Frankly, I think that's warranted. But more than anything, I'm looking at the actual reporter and his or her track record. There's a thing called human source reliability. And so I'm looking at the previous history of this source. What has this individual said? Has it been true? Well, if it's been true majority of the time, or most of the time, or all of the time, then I'm willing to put a lot more credence into what he's saying this time. So I would consider the source. After that, look at source motivation. Who is telling? Not only who is telling us, but why is this person going on record, or why is this person providing information to a New York Times reporter? Is this individual, is this source trying to encourage behavior? Ultimately, this is all psychological operations. It's behavior modification. We're going to put this piece of information out, and actually Dustin's actual PSYOP guy on this, but just briefly, and maybe Dustin can correct me later if I'm wrong, but putting this information out for consumption to people in order to modify their behavior, to change their feelings. We want to build pro-American sentiment in this village. Okay, here's some leaflets. We want to encourage this village to not cooperate with the Taliban. Great, drop some leaflets, put up a billboard, do whatever. Does that stuff happen inside the United States of America? Yeah, 100%, absolutely. I'm not saying the Army does this, but there are non-governmental organizations in the United States right now who are absolutely engaged in psychological operations and propaganda against you. So that's a very good question. And maybe we should even go a lot deeper on that, Dustin and I, on what to do in this era of propaganda. All right, next. Blinken said yesterday, Secretary of State Blinken said, quote, we are becoming, according to this question, quote, we are becoming increasingly concerned at the rise in human rights abuses in Mexico. Will there be U.S. intervention someday? I can't say 100% no, but I doubt it. the last thing the Mexican government wants, and the last thing just probably the average Mexican wants, is for U.S. boots to be on the ground or for U.S. Intervention or anything in Mexico. So I somewhat doubt it. But listen, Mexico is, I mean, they're a fragile state. They're about 2 inches away from being an absolute collapse. And so listen, the next big elections for Mexico are going to be in 2024. There's some state elections coming up in June, but 2024 is going to be the big presidential election. And I don't know, kind of have to take a look a little bit closer and see what happens. But listen, I talked about this on a show a couple of weeks ago. AMLO probably fancies himself as like another Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan dictator. So that's kind of what I expect. And I don't know if there'll be U.S. intervention or not. I doubt it. Man, there's some really great questions that I'm maybe going to answer on tomorrow's live stream, because we'll be over on the new show. Or did I say Monday? I guess on Monday I'll take a crack at these, or we'll move to like Odyssey or move to some other platform where I can tell you what I really think. Just not going to be on YouTube right now. Let's see. Let's do one more question here. So who are the major factions if the U.S. falls into major instability, and what nations may support what faction? Man, that's a great question. That's not something I can answer in the next 30 seconds, but I'll tell you, Matt Bracken is a former SEAL, Navy SEAL, and he has a thing called the CW2 cube. And it's a very good way to look at it. Low intensity conflict or Civil War II is not going to be just like, oh, left versus right or Democrats versus Republicans. There are a lot more factors at play here. And so I encourage you to go look at that CW cube. It's a 3-dimensional thing, right? There's not just an X and Y axis. There's depth to it as well. So we have to look at the rural versus urban divide. Obviously, there's a racial, religious, political aspect to it. Being a Republican doesn't mean that you're a conservative necessarily. There are a lot of Republicans who are like Con Inc., for instance, Conservative Inc. Incorporated. Being a Democrat doesn't mean that you're a socialist or a lot of people say, well, Democrats are communists, and no, like there's actual communist political parties out here. So I think there's a big difference between your average progressive and the tankies in this country. Certainly, and you look at the blog posts and social media posts from a lot of these far left groups, and look, they don't like liberals of today. They really don't care for progressives of today. So there's just a lot of nuance to this. And just because you got an R or a D next to your name, doesn't really mean anything, because that's a very surface level take. You kind of got to dig in and, like that, the world's shortest political quiz, more state power, less state power, that kind of thing. So, the best way for me to answer that question is to tell you to do your area study and look at what that looks like on your local level. So, based Matt Bracken, respecter. All right, gang, listen, that's going to do it for today. Tomorrow, I'll be back on the show, 2 p.m. We're going to keep talking about this stuff. And if you will do me a favor, tell your friend, if you like the show, if you like the stuff I'm talking about, you think it's thought-provoking, I try to throw a little bit behind this, not just some guy with opinions, but throw a lot of history and academic research into this, as well as just experiential learning from Iraq and Afghanistan, because I spent 3 years in Iraq and Afghanistan as an intel guy. So if you like what I do, please subscribe to the new channel, like this video, and tell your friends about it. And we'll be back on here tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central Time. And when things really heat up, I'll be able to cover a lot more of this stuff in a lot greater detail and with a greater sense of urgency. So everyone, thanks for watching. Until tomorrow, be well and stay out front.